Hill House stood alone, dark and foreboding against the backdrop of the hills. It loomed over the landscape like a forgotten giant, its jagged edges cutting sharply into the sky. For decades, rumors of its malevolence spread far and wide. People spoke in whispers about the strange happenings within its walls, events that no one could quite explain. Now, it was about to host a new group of visitors, each with their own reasons for being drawn to the house's mystery. Little did they know, they would leave with much more than they expected. Dr. John Montague, a scholar of the supernatural, was the one who had orchestrated this visit. A methodical man with a quiet obsession, he had spent years collecting accounts of haunted places, but Hill House was different. It had a reputation that made even the most hardened skeptic shudder. It wasn't just another haunted house. It was something worse, something alive in its own way. Dr. Montague believed that if he could document its phenomena, he would finally have the proof he needed to establish his theories on the supernatural. The doctor had invited 3 others to accompany him for the summer. Eleanor Vance was the first to accept the invitation. She was a woman who, for most of her life, had been invisible to the world. At 32, Eleanor had spent her youth caring for her ailing mother in a life of solitude. When her mother passed, Eleanor was left with nothing but her bitterness and regret. The invitation from Dr. Montague offered her something she had never had, an escape. Eleanor had no home to speak of, no career, and no one waiting for her anywhere. The idea of escaping the Hill House, even with its dark reputation, was better than returning to her sister's house, where she was nothing more than an unwanted burden. As she drove through the countryside, Eleanor felt a rush of exhilaration, a fleeting sense of freedom she hadn't known in years. But as the miles disappeared behind her and Hill House drew nearer, an uneasy feeling began to creep in. The second guest was Theodora, an artist with a sharp wit and a tendency to hide her true emotions behind laughter and sarcasm. She was everything Eleanor wasn't: confident, carefree, and vibrant. Dr. Montague had chosen her because of her supposed psychic sensitivity, although Theodora never took such things seriously. For her, this was just another adventure, a way to pass the time during the summer. Luke Sanderson, the final member of the group, was the heir to Hill House. Though he had never set foot inside it before, Luke wasn't thrilled about spending his time in a place everyone in his family avoided. But he was obliged to join the others, both because it was his inheritance and because his aunt insisted. To him, Hill House was simply an old structure, nothing more. He wasn't particularly interested in the supernatural, but he wasn't about to turn down the opportunity to meet new people and enjoy some good company. The 3 guests arrived separately, each with their own expectations, but all were struck by the sight of Hill House when they first laid eyes on it. Its towering walls seemed to lean toward them, as if they were being drawn into its grasp. The house was more than just unsettling. It was wrong in some unspoken way. The architecture was deliberately designed to disorient, with sharp angles and strange curves that made the house feel unnatural. It was as if the walls themselves were closing in, ready to trap anyone foolish enough to step inside. Eleanor was the first to arrive, her heart pounding as she approached the iron gates. She hesitated, gripping the wheel of her car tightly. Her first instinct was to turn back, to leave Hill House and never look back. But something kept her there. Perhaps it was her longing for a place where she could belong, or perhaps it was something darker, an unspoken pull from the house itself. With a deep breath, Eleanor pushed forward, driving through the gates and up the gravel road toward the house. As she parked and stepped out of the car, the stillness of the place enveloped her. No birds sang, no wind stirred the trees. It was as if the house existed in a world separate from everything else. As she made her way to the entrance, the heavy wooden doors creaked open, and she was greeted by Mrs. Dudley, the housekeeper, a doorwoman with a cold demeanor. Mrs. Dudley made it clear that she had no interest in the guests or their experiments. She had one job: to keep the house running, and she wasn't going to stick around after dark. "I leave before nightfall," she said flatly, her voice devoid of emotion. "No one stays after dark." Eleanor shivered, unsure if the warning was meant for her or if it was just Mrs. Dudley's way of doing things. Either way, the message was clear. Hill House had its own rules, and the living didn't belong there once the sun went down. Soon after, Theodora and Luke arrived, both of them trying to mask their unease with light conversation. Dr. Montague greeted them warmly, his excitement barely contained. This was the beginning of his great experiment, and he was certain that Hill House would deliver the proof he sought. Together, the group explored the house, marveling at its grand but unsettling design. Every room felt wrong. The proportions were slightly off, and the angles made them feel like they were being watched. As night fell, the group gathered in the parlor, ready for the first of many nights at Hill House. Outside, the sun disappeared behind the hills, casting long shadows across the house. Inside, the air grew colder, and a heavy silence settled over them. Eleanor felt it first, a sense of dread creeping up her spine, as if the house was slowly closing in around her. She glanced at Theodora, who smiled, seemingly unaffected, but Eleanor could see the flicker of fear in her eyes. Luke, too, shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Dr. Montague's voice broke the silence. "Welcome to Hill House," he said softly, "and may whatever walks here walk alone." But Eleanor knew, deep down, that they were never truly alone. Not in Hill House. The house had been waiting. The first night at Hill House was quiet, unnervingly so. No disturbances, no cold drafts, no ghostly whispers. Just a heavy, suffocating stillness that seemed to press in on all sides. For the group, this silence felt like a reprieve, though none of them voiced their relief aloud. Dr. Montague had warned them that the house would take time to reveal its secrets, and so they settled into the routine of exploring the mansion, observing its strange features, and waiting for something to happen. Eleanor, in particular, was on edge. She had expected immediate signs of the supernatural, perhaps a door slamming on its own, or the faint sound of footsteps in the hallway. But Hill House didn't offer any such obvious signs. Instead, it exerted a quieter, more insidious influence. There was something unsettling in the air, something unseen yet always present. Eleanor couldn't shake the feeling that the house was watching her, biding its time. Theodora, ever the optimist, treated the situation lightly. She made jokes to ease the tension, poking fun at the house's ominous reputation. "I was expecting more theatrics," she said one morning over breakfast. "A little poltergeist action, at least." Eleanor smiled, grateful for the attempt at levity, but the nagging sense of dread in the pit of her stomach never fully went away. Theodora seemed so at ease, but Eleanor wondered if it was just a mask to hide her own unease. Luke, on the other hand, appeared disinterested. He spent his time lounging around, flipping through old books he found in the library, or lazily inspecting the rooms. For him, this was nothing more than a bizarre vacation, and his carefree attitude irritated Eleanor. How could he be so indifferent when Hill House felt so palpably dangerous? Dr. Montague remained the most focused. He wandered the halls with his notebook, jotting down every strange detail, even if it was nothing more than a creaky floorboard or a faint change in temperature. He believed that the house would eventually begin to manifest its true nature, and he was determined not to miss a single moment. The doctor's presence reassured Eleanor, but only slightly. His rational explanations provided a counterbalance to her growing anxiety. But as each day passed, Eleanor couldn't shake the feeling that something was subtly changing inside her. As the days turned into nights, the group began to notice the small, almost imperceptible oddities that defined Hill House. The doors never stayed open, no matter how wide they were left. They always swung shut with a soft click, as if the house refused to let the outside world in. The angles of the rooms felt wrong, the corners too sharp or too curved, creating a sense of disorientation. At times, the halls seemed to stretch longer than they had before, as though the house were shifting itself around them. Eleanor found herself strangely drawn to the house, as if it were calling to her in some silent way. She would wander the halls alone, feeling a connection to the mansion she couldn't explain. The house's dark wood paneling and intricate carvings seemed to pulse with a life of their own. There were moments when Eleanor felt almost comforted by the oppressive stillness, as though Hill House understood her in a way no one else ever had. But along with that comfort came a growing sense of unease. Each night, Eleanor would wake in her bed, heart racing, convinced that someone or something was standing just outside her door. She would lie there, frozen, listening to the silence, trying to convince herself it was all in her mind. But the feeling of being watched never left her. The others began to feel it too. One evening, as they sat in the parlor, Theodora broke the silence with a nervous laugh. "Does anyone else feel like the house is staring at us?" she asked, trying to keep her tone light. Luke raised an eyebrow, glancing around. "I wouldn't say staring," he replied, "but there's definitely something strange about this place." Dr. Montague nodded thoughtfully, as if he had expected this. "Hill House is known for its ability to influence," he said carefully. "It's not always about what you can see or hear. The house affects you in subtle ways. You might feel watched or uneasy, but it's all part of the experience. We must remain objective." Objective. Eleanor clung to that word, but it felt hollow. How could she remain objective when the walls themselves seemed to be closing in on her? She had never been one to believe in the supernatural, yet Hill House was doing something to her, something that made her question everything she thought she knew. The next night, the disturbances began in earnest. It started with a loud banging sound, echoing through the house. The group was gathered in the parlor when the noise rang out, startling them all. Theodora jumped, knocking over a teacup, while Luke muttered a curse under his breath. Dr. Montague stood, listening carefully. "Did you hear where it came from?" he asked, his voice tense. Eleanor shook her head, her heart pounding. The noise seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, reverberating off the walls. Another bang followed, then another, growing louder and more insistent. The sound was unlike anything Eleanor had ever heard, deep, guttural, and impossibly loud, as if the house itself was groaning in pain. "Stay together," Dr. Montague instructed, his voice steady despite the tension in the room. They huddled together, listening as the noise continued to echo through the halls. After what felt like an eternity, the banging stopped as suddenly as it had begun, leaving behind an eerie silence. Eleanor's breath came in shallow gasps. She could feel her pulse racing, her skin cold with fear. She wanted to believe it was just a structural issue old houses creaked, after all, but deep down, she knew it wasn't that simple. Hill House was waking up, and it was starting to reach out. That night, the group decided to retire early, but sleep was elusive. Eleanor lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, her mind racing. Every sound, every creak of the floorboards sent a fresh wave of anxiety through her. She closed her eyes, trying to force herself to sleep, but the unease lingered. It was then that she heard a soft voice, barely audible, calling her name. At first, she thought it was her imagination, but the voice came again, clearer this time. "Eleanor," it whispered, gentle yet insistent. Her eyes flew open, and she sat up in bed, heart pounding. The voice was coming from outside her door, just beyond the threshold. She swallowed, gripping the edges of the blanket tightly. Was someone playing a cruel trick on her, or was this the house? The possibility of either terrified her. She stayed frozen in bed, unable to move, until the voice faded into the silence once more. The fear lingered, even after the sound was gone. and Eleanor couldn't shake the feeling that the house had spoken to her personally, intimately, in a way that no one else had experienced. Hill House was no longer just a house. It was something more, something alive, and Eleanor feared it had chosen her. The first night at Hill House was quiet, unnervingly so. No disturbances, no cold drafts, no ghostly whispers. Just a heavy, suffocating stillness that seemed to press in on all sides. For the group, this silence felt like a reprieve, though none of them voiced their relief aloud. Dr. Montague had warned them that the house would take time to reveal its secrets, and so they settled into the routine of exploring the mansion, observing its strange features, and waiting for something to happen. Eleanor, in particular, was on edge. She had expected immediate signs of the supernatural, perhaps a door slamming on its own, or the faint sound of footsteps in the hallway. But Hill House didn't offer any such obvious signs. Instead, it exerted a quieter, more insidious influence. There was something unsettling in the air, something unseen yet always present. Eleanor couldn't shake the feeling that the house was watching her, biding its time. Theodora, ever the optimist, treated the situation lightly. She made jokes to ease the tension, poking fun at the house's ominous reputation. "I was expecting more theatrics," she said one morning over breakfast. "A little poltergeist action, at least." Eleanor smiled, grateful for the attempt at levity, but the nagging sense of dread in the pit of her stomach never fully went away. Theodora seemed so at ease, but Eleanor wondered if it was just a mask to hide her own unease. Luke, on the other hand, appeared disinterested. He spent his time lounging around, flipping through old books he found in the library, or lazily inspecting the rooms. For him, this was nothing more than a bizarre vacation, and his carefree attitude irritated Eleanor. How could he be so indifferent when Hill House felt so palpably dangerous? Dr. Montague remained the most focused. He wandered the halls with his notebook, jotting down every strange detail, even if it was nothing more than a creaky floorboard or a faint change in temperature. He believed that the house would eventually begin to manifest its true nature, and he was determined not to miss a single moment. The doctor's presence reassured Eleanor, but only slightly. His rational explanations provided a counterbalance to her growing anxiety. But as each day passed, Eleanor couldn't shake the feeling that something was subtly changing inside her. As the days turned into nights, the group began to notice the small, almost imperceptible oddities that defined Hill House. The doors never stayed open, no matter how wide they were left. They always swung shut with a soft click, as if the house refused to let the outside world in. The angles of the rooms felt wrong, the corners too sharp or too curved, creating a sense of disorientation. At times, the halls seemed to stretch longer than they had before, as though the house were shifting itself around them. Eleanor found herself strangely drawn to the house, as if it were calling to her in some silent way. She would wander the halls alone, feeling a connection to the mansion she couldn't explain. The house's dark wood paneling and intricate carvings seemed to pulse with a life of their own. There were moments when Eleanor felt almost comforted by the oppressive stillness, as though Hill House understood her in a way no one else ever had. But along with that comfort came a growing sense of unease. Each night, Eleanor would wake in her bed, heart racing, convinced that someone or something was standing just outside her door. She would lie there, frozen, listening to the silence, trying to convince herself it was all in her mind. But the feeling of being watched never left her. The others began to feel it too. One evening, as they sat in the parlor, Theodora broke the silence with a nervous laugh. "Does anyone else feel like the house is staring at us?" she asked, trying to keep her tone light. Luke raised an eyebrow, glancing around. "I wouldn't say staring," he replied, "but there's definitely something strange about this place." Dr. Montague nodded thoughtfully, as if he had expected this. "Hill House is known for its ability to influence," he said carefully. it's not always about what you can see or hear. The house affects you in subtle ways. You might feel watched or uneasy, but it's all part of the experience. We must remain objective. Objective. Eleanor clung to that word, but it felt hollow. How could she remain objective when the walls themselves seemed to be closing in on her? She had never been one to believe in the supernatural, yet Hill House was doing something to her, something that made her question everything she thought she knew. The next night, the disturbances began in earnest. It started with a loud banging sound, echoing through the house. The group was gathered in the parlor when the noise rang out, startling them all. Theodora jumped, knocking over her teacup, while Luke muttered a curse under his breath. Dr. Montague stood, listening carefully. "Did you hear where it came from?" he asked, his voice tense. Eleanor shook her head, her heart pounding. The noise seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, reverberating off the walls. Another bang followed, then another, growing louder and more insistent. The sound was unlike anything Eleanor had ever heard, deep, guttural, and impossibly loud, as if the house itself was groaning in pain. "Stay together," Dr. Montague instructed, his voice steady despite the tension in the room. They huddled together, listening as the noise continued to echo through the halls. After what felt like an eternity, the banging stopped as suddenly as it had begun, leaving behind an eerie silence. Eleanor's breath came in shallow gasps. She could feel her pulse racing, her skin cold with fear. She wanted to believe it was just a structural issue old houses creaked. After all, but deep down, she knew it wasn't that simple. Hill House was waking up, and it was starting to reach out. That night, the group decided to retire early, but sleep was elusive. Eleanor lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, her mind racing. Every sound, every creak of the floorboards sent a fresh wave of anxiety through her. She closed her eyes, trying to force herself to sleep, but the unease lingered. It was then that she heard a soft voice, barely audible, calling her name. At first, she thought it was her imagination, but the voice came again, clearer this time. "Eleanor," it whispered, gentle yet insistent. Her eyes flew open, and she sat up in bed, heart pounding. The voice was coming from outside her door, just beyond the threshold. She swallowed, gripping the edges of the blanket tightly. Was someone playing a cruel trick on her, or was this the house? The possibility of either terrified her. She stayed frozen in bed, unable to move, until the voice faded into the silence once more. The fear lingered, even after the sound was gone, and Eleanor couldn't shake the feeling that the house had spoken to her personally, intimately, in a way that no one else had experienced. Hill House was no longer just a house. It was something more, something alive, and Eleanor feared it had chosen her. The days in Hill House began to blur, each one bleeding into the next. The once playful atmosphere among the group had grown tense, weighed down by the increasing strangeness that seemed to infest every corner of the mansion. The subtle disturbances that had started with noises and inexplicable cold spots were now escalating into something far more sinister. Eleanor felt it most acutely. Each night, her dreams became more vivid, more disorienting. Shadows danced across her room, and she swore she could hear whispers, the same voice that had called her name that first night. The voice no longer startled her, though. Ooh. Instead, she found herself listening for it, waiting for it to speak again. And when it did, it was almost comforting, as though the house understood her deepest thoughts and longings. But that comfort came with a price. Hill House was changing Eleanor. Where once she had been shy, withdrawn, and uncertain, now she felt a strange, dark confidence creeping in. It wasn't the kind of confidence that made her feel stronger. It was more like a weight pressing down on her, pushing her to let go of her old self. Every time she wandered the house alone, she felt it pulling her further into its grasp. as if it were slowly becoming a part of her. The others noticed the change in her, but no one spoke of it directly. Theodora, ever sensitive to the emotions of those around her, had grown distant from Eleanor. Where they once shared a bond, an unspoken tension now lingered between them. Theodora still laughed and joked, but her gaze had become sharp, suspicious. She was watching Eleanor carefully, as if she were afraid of what her friend might do, or perhaps of what the house might do to her. One evening, as they gathered in the parlor, Theodora finally confronted Eleanor, though her words were veiled in humor. "You're looking a little pale, Eleanor," she said with a playful smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Hill House isn't agreeing with you, is it?" Eleanor bristled at the comment, her nerves already frayed from the sleepless nights and the constant feeling of being watched. "I'm fine," she snapped, more harshly than she intended. She immediately regretted it, but the words were out, and she saw the flicker of surprise and perhaps fear in Theodora's expression. Dr. Montague, ever the mediator, stepped in to ease the tension. "We're all under a lot of stress," he said calmly. "Hill House has a way of playing tricks on the mind. It's important that we stick together and not let the house influence us." But even as he spoke, the house seemed to respond. A loud, hollow knock echoed through the walls, as if something was rapping on the wood from within. The noise reverberated through the room, freezing them in place. Eleanor's heart pounded as she listened. It wasn't just a random sound. It was deliberate, rhythmic, almost as if someone or something was trying to get in. Luke, who had been lounging carelessly in his chair, jumped to his feet, his face pale. What the hell was that? He muttered, his usual nonchalance gone. Dr. Montague motioned for calm, but the tension was thick in the air. "Everyone stay together," he ordered. "We've prepared for this. It's just the house. It's reacting to us." Reacting. Eleanor felt the word sink into her mind like a stone. The house wasn't just reacting, it was communicating. She could feel it. It was reaching out, trying to make contact, and she was the one it had chosen. The knocking continued, growing louder and more insistent. The group huddled closer together, their fear palpable. For a moment, Eleanor felt an overwhelming urge to flee, to escape the house's grasp and never look back. But even as the thought crossed her mind, another voice, her own, but darker, quieter, whispered inside her, "This is where you belong. Don't leave, not yet." The noise abruptly stopped, leaving an oppressive silence in its wake. The group sat frozen, their breaths shallow, waiting for the next attack, but nothing came. After what felt like hours, Dr. Montague finally spoke. "It's over for now," he said, though his voice was tense. "We need to stay vigilant. The house is testing us." They retired to their rooms early that night, though none of them expected to sleep. Eleanor lay in her bed, staring at the ceiling, the events of the evening replaying in her mind. The knocking, the tension, Theodora's strange look, all of it felt like a warning. But from whom? From the house? Or from herself? Sleep, when it finally came, was shallow and filled with disturbing dreams. Eleanor found herself wandering through the dark corridors of Hill House, but the walls were different, now closer, more confining. They seemed to pulse with life, breathing in sync with her own panicked breaths. As she walked, the floor shifted beneath her feet, and the air grew thick, almost suffocating. In her dream, the house whispered to her again, that same familiar voice. "You can't leave, Eleanor. You don't want to. This is where you're meant to be." She awoke in a cold sweat, her heart racing. For a moment, she didn't know where she was, the dream still clinging to her like a second skin. The room was dark, the shadows deep and unfamiliar, but the overwhelming sense of being watched was all too real. Eleanor glanced at the door. It was closed, just as she had left it, but something was wrong, she could feel it. Slowly, she swung her legs over the side of the bed, her feet touching the cold floor. She stood, hesitating for a moment, then moved toward the door, her heart pounding in her ears. When she opened it, the hallway stretched out before her, empty and silent. But the moment she stepped outside, she felt the temperature drop. The cold wrapped around her like a tight grip, and the air seemed to hum with a low, steady vibration. She wasn't alone. Something was out there, lurking just beyond the edge of her vision. The whisper came again, soft but insistent. "Come closer, Eleanor." She didn't move. She couldn't. Her body felt frozen, as if the house had taken control of her limbs, holding her in place. The whisper grew louder, more demanding, as if it were coming from inside her own mind. Closer. Eleanor clenched her fists, fighting the urge to move, to obey. But the pull was too strong. She took one step forward, then another, her feet moving of their own accord. The shadows in the hallway seemed to shift, growing darker, thicker, until they almost swallowed her whole. And then, just as quickly as it had begun, the feeling vanished. The cold dissipated, the air returned to normal, and Eleanor was left standing in the middle of the hallway, trembling. She didn't know how long she stood there, but when she finally gathered the strength to return to her room, she collapsed onto the bed, exhausted and terrified. The next morning, she told no one what had happened. Not Theodora, not Dr. Montague, not even Luke, who seemed as unaffected by the house as ever. But Eleanor knew that something inside her had changed. The house had touched her, reached into her mind, and planted a seed of doubt that was slowly growing. Hill House was no longer just a building. It was something more, a living entity, feeding off their fear, twisting their thoughts, and slowly unraveling their sense of reality. And Eleanor, whether she admitted it or not, was becoming part of it. By the time the 4th week in Hill House arrived, the atmosphere had shifted from eerie to oppressive. Every inch of the house seemed charged with a malevolent energy that none of them could fully explain. No longer content with subtle whispers and cold drafts, the house had grown more active, more aggressive. It was as if the mansion itself was waking up, and its attention was fixed on Eleanor. Theodora, once a source of comfort with her sharp wit and playful teasing, now kept her distance from Eleanor. The tension between them was palpable, and Eleanor couldn't ignore the feeling that Theodora was afraid of her, or rather, of what the house was doing to her. The unspoken barrier between them only made Eleanor feel more isolated, more trapped in her own mind. She began to question whether Theodora had ever truly been her friend, or if she had just been pretending all along. Luke, who had never taken the haunting seriously, was becoming more and more irritable. His usual carefree attitude had given way to frustration, and he spent much of his time pacing through the house, as though he was searching for an escape. But there was no escape, not from Hill House. The mansion's strange geometry seemed to twist and turn in on itself, making the corridors feel endless and the rooms disorienting. Even when they tried to leave, the house had a way of leading them back inside. Dr. Montague was still focused on his research, scribbling notes with frantic determination. But even he was beginning to show signs of strain. His once calm demeanor had cracked, revealing the deep anxiety beneath. The house was proving more powerful than he had anticipated, and though he tried to maintain a scientific detachment, it was clear that Hill House had shaken him. He had lost control of the experiment, and he knew it. Eleanor, meanwhile, was slipping further into the house's grip. Her dreams had become darker, more vivid, and the line between reality and imagination was blurring. She could no longer tell if the strange things she was experiencing were real, or if the house was playing tricks on her mind. The whispers had become more frequent, more persistent, and they no longer scared her. In fact, she had started to listen to them, to find comfort in their words. They understand me. The house understands me. It was a dangerous thought, but Eleanor couldn't help it. The more isolated she felt from the others, the more she turned to the house for comfort. It whispered to her, telling her that she belonged there, that she didn't need the others. And Eleanor began to believe it. One night, after another unsettling evening filled with unexplained noises and shifting shadows, Eleanor found herself wandering the halls of Hill House alone. She didn't know what had drawn her out of bed. Perhaps it was the pull of the house, or perhaps it was her own restless mind. Either way, she found herself moving through the mansion's darkened corridors, the wooden floorboards creaking softly beneath her feet. The house seemed to breathe around her, its very walls pulsating with a strange energy. Eleanor felt calm, almost serene, as if she were finally where she was meant to be. For the first time in her life, she felt seen. Truly seen. She came to a door at the end of the hallway, one she had never noticed before. It was slightly ajar, as if inviting her inside. Without hesitation, she pushed it open and stepped into the room beyond. It was a small, dimly lit space with a single window that looked out over the dark, empty grounds of Hill House. The air in the room was cold, but Eleanor didn't feel the chill. Instead, she felt a strange warmth radiating from the center of the room. There, in the middle of the floor, was a mirror. Its surface was cracked, the fractured glass reflecting distorted images of the room and of Eleanor herself. She stepped closer, staring at her reflection. Her face looked pale, drawn, and tired, but there was something else in her eyes, something dark and unfamiliar. The mirror whispered to her, "You don't need them. They're holding you back. You've always been alone, Eleanor, but here, you can be free. You can be yourself." Eleanor's hands trembled as she reached out to touch the mirror's cracked surface. The moment her fingers brushed the glass, she felt a surge of energy course through her. It wasn't painful, but it was overwhelming, like the house itself was pouring its power into her. For a brief, terrifying moment, Eleanor felt as though she were losing herself. The weight of her loneliness, her grief, her anger, it all pressed down on her, threatening to consume her. But the house whispered again, soothing her. "Let go, Eleanor. Let go of who you were. Be free." And she did. In that moment, standing before the cracked mirror, Eleanor let go. She let go of the years she had spent caring for her mother, of the bitterness and resentment that had built up inside her. She let go of the shame, the regret, the feeling of being invisible. And as she did, she felt something shift within her, something dark, something powerful. The house had given her a gift. It had taken her pain, her loneliness, and turned it into something else, something stronger. When Eleanor returned to the others the next morning, they noticed the change immediately. Her demeanor was different, calmer, more assured, but there was something unsettling about the way she carried herself. Theodora watched her with wary eyes, while Luke seemed to avoid her altogether. Even Dr. Montague appeared unnerved, though he said nothing. That day, the disturbances escalated. The walls groaned under an invisible pressure, and strange, unexplainable phenomena occurred throughout the house. Doors slammed shut with deafening force, and objects moved on their own. It was as if Hill House was coming alive, feeding off the group's fear and uncertainty. And through it all, Eleanor remained calm. She no longer felt afraid of the house. She felt connected to it. The house had chosen her, and she had accepted it. But Theodora wasn't fooled. That evening, as they sat together in the parlor, Theodora turned to Eleanor, her voice low and tense. "What's happening to you?" she asked. Her eyes narrowed. "You're not the same, Eleanor. You're different." Eleanor smiled, but it wasn't the warm, shy smile she had once worn. It was something colder, more distant. "I'm fine," she said softly. "I've just realized something, that's all." Theodora shook her head, her frustration bubbling to the surface. "This house is doing something to you. It's trying to take you. Don't you see that?" Eleanor's smile faded. "Maybe I don't want to leave," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "Maybe this is where I belong." Theodora stared at her, horrified. Eleanor, no. This isn't you. The house is manipulating you. But Eleanor had stopped listening. The house's whispers were louder now, drowning out Theodora's voice. You don't need her. She's afraid of you. She'll never understand. And Eleanor believed it. She no longer needed the others. Hill House had given her something far more valuable, a sense of belonging, a place where she could finally be free. The cracks that had formed in her mind were spreading, and Eleanor could feel herself slipping further and further into the house's grasp. She didn't fight it. In the days that followed, the manifestations grew more violent. The house was unraveling, its dark energy seeping into every corner, every crevice. The others tried to reason with Eleanor, to pull her back, but it was too late. Hill House had claimed her, and she had let it. The house had become her refuge, her sanctuary, and she wasn't going to leave. Not ever. The final days in Hill House were a descent into chaos. The mansion, once eerie but manageable, now seemed intent on consuming those within it. Every room, every hallway felt alive with a malevolent energy that no one could ignore. The subtle games Hill House had played, the knocks, the whispers were gone. Now it was a full assault. The house wanted them out. Or worse, it wanted to trap them there forever. Eleanor had fully surrendered to its pull. Her connection to the house had deepened to the point where she could no longer tell where she ended and Hill House began. The whispers that had once haunted her in the dark now filled her mind even in the daylight. They were no longer warnings or invitations. They were commands, insistent and relentless. Stay. You belong here. Let go of everything else. This is your home. Dr. Montague was the first to openly acknowledge the danger Eleanor was in. His once scientific curiosity had turned into concern. We need to leave, he said to the group, his voice strained with the realization that he had lost control of the situation. The house is becoming dangerous, especially for Eleanor. It's influencing her, perhaps more than we understand. But Eleanor wasn't listening. She was sitting by the window, gazing out into the bleak, foggy landscape that surrounded Hill House. Her expression was distant, almost peaceful, as though she was no longer part of the conversation. In her mind, the house was all that mattered. The outside world had become irrelevant. Theodora's patience had long since run out. We can't just sit here and watch this happen, she snapped, her usual sharpness undercut by real fear. She glanced over at Eleanor, her eyes filled with a mix of anger and concern. She's not herself anymore. The house has taken her, and we have to do something. Luke, standing near the door, looked ready to leave at any moment. His usual bravado was gone, replaced by a cold, hard fear that he couldn't shake. We've stayed too long, he muttered. We need to get out while we still can. But Eleanor wasn't leaving. She had made that clear. And more than that, the house wouldn't let her go. The others could sense it. Hill House had its grip on her, and it wasn't about to loosen. That night, the house showed its full power. The walls shook, the floors groaned, and doors slammed with a force that rattled the entire structure. It felt like the house was coming apart at the seams, but instead of fear, Eleanor felt exhilaration. The house was alive, and it was speaking to her. It wanted her. As the others scrambled in panic, trying to figure out whether to flee or huddle together in safety, Eleanor moved calmly through the chaos. The shadows seemed to reach for her, embracing her as she walked through the darkened halls. The whispers were louder now, almost deafening, but they no longer frightened her. You're home, Eleanor. This is where you've always belonged. The others tried to stop her. Theodora reached for her arm, pleading with her to come back to reality. But Eleanor pulled away with a strength that startled her friend. Dr. Montague tried to reason with her, his voice breaking with desperation, but his words didn't reach her. Luke, too scared to even approach her, watched from a distance, his face pale and drawn. Eleanor moved toward the grand staircase, her steps slow and deliberate. The house had led her there, guiding her to this final moment. The staircase loomed before her, a towering symbol of the house's power. She could feel the air around her vibrating with energy, as if the house itself was alive, watching her every move. As she stood at the top of the stairs, the voices filled her mind completely. "End it here, Eleanor. This is your final step. It's the only way to be free." For a brief moment, Eleanor hesitated. She looked down at the others below, their faces filled with horror and helplessness. But their fear felt distant to her now. The house had become her reality, and the people she once called friends were just shadows in her mind. Then, without another thought, Eleanor let herself go. But as she took the step forward, something in her shifted. A small, quiet voice her own fought its way through the cacophony of whispers. "Is this really what I want?" For a moment, Eleanor faltered. The house seemed to tighten its grip, but her mind, buried deep beneath the house's influence, was fighting back. She thought of the life she had left behind lonely, yes, but still hers. She remembered the kindness of strangers, the feeling of sunlight on her face, the warmth of a world beyond Hill House. Was it really too late to turn back? But the house was relentless. There is no turning back. This is where you belong. You can't escape now. The others watched in horror as Eleanor wavered at the top of the staircase. Dr. Montague shouted her name, his voice filled with a mixture of fear and desperation. Theodora cried out, rushing toward the stairs, but Luke held her back, too afraid of what Eleanor might do. And then, with a final, shattering cry, Eleanor stepped forward. The house roared around her as she fell. Time seemed to slow as she tumbled down the stairs, her body twisting in the air. The others rushed to her, their footsteps pounding against the floor as they raced to catch her. But it was too late. Eleanor lay crumpled at the base of the staircase, her eyes closed, her body still. For a moment, there was only silence. The house, as if satisfied, seemed to calm. The groaning walls, the slamming doors, they all stopped. Hill House was still, as though it had finally taken what it wanted. Dr. Montague knelt beside Eleanor, his hand shaking as he checked for signs of life. Theodora stood frozen, her face pale, her eyes wide with shock. Luke hovered nearby, his usual bravado gone, replaced by a hollow fear. But Eleanor was alive. She stirred slightly, her eyes fluttering open, and for a brief moment, she looked at the others as though seeing them for the first time in weeks. Her voice, weak but clear, broke the silence. I'm sorry," she whispered. The house remained quiet as they gathered her up, carrying her carefully to her room. The others didn't speak, their minds too overwhelmed by what had happened. Eleanor, too weak to stand, allowed herself to be led away. As she lay in bed that night, her body aching, her mind exhausted, Eleanor finally understood. Hill House had tried to take her, but something within her had resisted. She had come to the edge, looked into the abyss, and somehow she had pulled back. For now, but the house wasn't done with her. She could still feel its pull, still hear its whispers in the back of her mind. The fight wasn't over, and Eleanor knew it. Hill House was a living thing, and it didn't let go easily. As the house settled into its familiar, oppressive silence, Eleanor closed her eyes. Tomorrow, she would leave. She had to. But part of her wondered if she would ever truly be free of Hill House, or if it had already taken more of her than she realized. The Bell family lived a quiet and peaceful life in the rural countryside of Adams, Tennessee, in the early 19th century. John Bell, the patriarch, was a well-respected farmer who had moved to the area with his wife, Lucy, and their children, hoping to build a prosperous and serene life. Their farmhouse, nestled among sprawling fields and towering trees, seemed like the perfect place to raise a family. Little did they know, something far darker lurked beneath the calm surface of their lives. It was in 1817 when strange things began to occur on the Bell property. At first, the signs were subtle and easy to dismiss. John would occasionally see odd animals wandering near the edges of his fields, creatures he couldn't quite identify, their forms shifting and unnatural. He spotted what looked like a large dog with a rabbit's head, and another time, a bird too large for the region perched in a tree. These sightings left him uneasy, but he chalked them up to tricks of the mind, refusing to believe anything was truly wrong. Soon, however, the strange events escalated beyond harmless wildlife. The first real sign of trouble came when John Bell began hearing odd sounds around the farmhouse. At night, the walls creaked and groaned in ways that didn't seem natural, like the wood itself was trying to speak. The noise of knocking echoed through the rooms, and sometimes it seemed like chains were being dragged across the floor, though nothing was ever found out of place. It wasn't long before the rest of the family began to notice these sounds as well. The Bell children, especially young Betsy, started waking up terrified, claiming they heard faint whispering in their ears while they slept. Lucy Bell, though skeptical at first, could no longer deny that something was very wrong when she too began hearing unexplained sounds, as though someone or something was watching them from just beyond their sight. One evening, as the family sat around their dinner table, a loud, sharp knock came from the front door. John, thinking it might be a late visitor or a neighbor in need, got up to answer it, only to find no one there. The knock came again, this time from the back door, but once again, there was no one in sight. The third knock came from inside the house itself. The family sat frozen in fear, unable to explain how this could be happening. They had begun to realize that something far more sinister than a prank was at play. Over the next few days, the haunting sounds grew louder and more frequent. It was as though the house had come alive with a presence that couldn't be seen, but was undeniably there. The walls echoed with strange voices, doors creaked open and shut on their own, and footsteps could be heard pacing through empty rooms. Yet, whenever the family tried to investigate, they found nothing. It was as though an invisible force had taken up residence in their home, and it wasn't going to leave anytime soon. John Bell, being a man of faith and reason, sought to keep his family calm, reassuring them that there had to be a logical explanation. Perhaps it was the wind or some natural phenomena, but deep down, he knew better. Something was wrong, terribly wrong, and no amount of reason could explain away the growing terror they felt each night. Despite his outward calm, he couldn't shake the creeping fear that this presence had come for him. Specifically, the once tranquil Bell home had become a place of dread. No longer able to ignore the strange happenings, John confided in a close neighbor, seeking advice on what to do. But the neighbor had no solutions. Word began to spread in the small community that the Bell family was experiencing something otherworldly, though few believed it at first. After all, who would believe that a house could be haunted by something invisible, something so relentless and violent? The days passed, but the entity showed no sign of leaving. The family could no longer sleep through the night, as the knocking, the scratching sounds, and the heavy footsteps never ceased. It was as if the entity wanted them to know it was always there, lurking just beyond the edge of their understanding, waiting for something darker yet to come. As the weeks wore on, the Bell family found themselves slipping into a state of constant fear and exhaustion. They had no idea what the entity wanted, but they knew it wasn't going to leave on its own. Whatever this presence was, it had taken root in their home, and they were helpless to stop it. The Bell Witch had arrived, and the nightmare was only beginning. As the days turned into weeks, the Bell family's quiet farmhouse became a place of escalating fear and confusion. What had begun as strange noises and eerie disturbances quickly transformed into something far more aggressive. It seemed the entity, whatever it was was growing stronger. No longer content with simply haunting the house, it began to physically target the family, with a particular focus on John Bell and his young daughter, Betsy. The first signs of the entity's more dangerous nature emerged when Betsy started to experience strange sensations at night. At first, it felt like gentle taps on her skin, like someone lightly flicking her arm. She tried to ignore it, thinking it was nothing more than her imagination. But soon, these sensations grew into something much more alarming. She would wake up in the middle of the night to the feeling of her hair being yanked, her bed covers ripped off, or an invisible hand slapping her face. These attacks left her terrified and helpless, but they were just the beginning. As Betsy's torment grew, so did the malevolent presence in the house. Objects that once sat quietly on shelves would now fly across the room without warning, smashing into walls or crashing to the floor. Chairs would tip over by themselves, and dishes would shatter for no apparent reason. The invisible force seemed to revel in causing chaos, as if it found joy in making the Bell family live in constant fear. John Bell, too, was not spared from the entity's wrath. One morning, as he was working in the fields, he felt a sudden sharp pain in his face, as though he had been struck by an unseen hand. He stumbled, clutching his cheek, but when he looked around, there was no one there. This mysterious attack repeated itself several times over the coming weeks. John would be walking through his home or tending to his land when, without warning, he would feel the sting of an invisible force hitting him. Sometimes it was a slap, other times a violent push that nearly knocked him off his feet. The relentless torment began to take its toll on the entire family. Betsy, once a bright and lively girl, became withdrawn and fearful. She spent her days in a constant state of anxiety, never knowing when the next attack would come. Her schoolwork suffered, and she became too frightened to sleep alone at night, often seeking comfort in her parents' room. The stress weighed heavily on John and Lucy Bell as well, as they watched their daughter suffer and felt powerless to stop it. Despite their growing desperation, the Bell family tried to maintain some sense of normalcy. They continued their daily routines, farming, cooking, and tending to the household, hoping that by ignoring the entity, it might go away. But the more they ignored it, the more aggressive it seemed to become. The Bell children, especially Betsy, were often targeted while they slept. On one particularly terrifying night, Betsy awoke to find herself being lifted from her bed by an unseen force. She screamed in terror, and her parents rushed to her room, only to find her suspended in midair, her body thrashing as if being held by an invisible grip. As soon as John and Lucy entered the room, Betsy was dropped back onto her bed, gasping for breath and trembling with fear. There was no explanation for what had just happened, no way to rationalize the nightmare their daughter was living through. The attacks didn't stop with Betsy. Other members of the household also began experiencing physical assaults. Knocks and slaps came out of nowhere, leaving bruises and welts on their skin. The Bell family soon realized that they were dealing with a force beyond their understanding, one that was not only malicious, but intelligent. It seemed to know exactly when and how to strike, always leaving them on edge, waiting for the next act of violence. Word of the Bell family's plight began to spread throughout the community. Neighbors who visited the house witnessed the strange occurrences for themselves, objects moving on their own, doors slamming shut, and the eerie sounds of whispering voices that seemed to come from nowhere. Some locals believed the family had fallen victim to a powerful curse, while others thought they were dealing with an angry spirit seeking revenge for some past wrong. As the entity's attacks grew more frequent and more violent, the family became desperate for answers. John Bell turned to friends and neighbors for help, hoping that someone might know how to rid their home of the invisible force. But no one had any solutions. Ministers and pastors were called in to pray over the house, but even their spiritual guidance couldn't stop the torment. The Bell family began to lose hope, feeling as though they were trapped in a nightmare with no way out. The Bell Witch, as the entity had now come to be called, was relentless. It seemed to feed off the family's fear and suffering, growing more powerful with each passing day. John Bell, in particular, seemed to be the primary target. His health began to deteriorate as the constant stress and fear took a toll on his body. His once strong frame became frail, and his hands shook with anxiety. It was clear that the entity wanted something, but what it wanted remained a mystery. Despite the family's efforts to resist, they were losing their battle against the unseen force. The Bell Witch had made its intentions clear. It wasn't going to leave until it had finished whatever dark mission it had come to carry out. And as the attacks on Betsy and John grew more intense, the family couldn't help but wonder if they would survive the ordeal. The torment had already reached unbearable heights for the Bell family, but they were about to discover that the entity haunting their home was far more terrifying than they ever imagined. What had begun as an invisible, violent presence soon revealed itself to be something that could speak, something that could communicate with chilling clarity. It wasn't just a ghost or some mindless force. It was intelligent, cunning, and it had a voice. The first time the entity spoke, it caught the family completely off guard. They had grown used to the eerie knocks, disembodied footsteps, and the unsettling physical attacks. But when the family was sitting quietly one evening, bracing themselves for whatever might come next, a voice filled the room cold, clear, and unmistakably human. It came from nowhere and everywhere all at once, as if the very walls of the house were speaking. "I am here for John Bell," the voice said plainly. The family froze, staring at one another in disbelief. Was this some kind of cruel trick? But no, they all heard it. John Bell's face drained of color. Whatever this thing was, it had just declared that it was targeting him specifically. The air in the room seemed to thicken with dread as the voice continued, sometimes mocking, sometimes angry, but always clear in its hatred for John. The entity called itself Kate, though it later became widely known as the Bell Witch, and it made no secret of its intentions. The voice was unlike anything they had ever experienced before. It wasn't just random murmurs or whispers. It spoke in full sentences, as if it were a living person. It would ask questions, make demands, and even hold conversations with the family and their visitors. What made it even more terrifying was its depth of knowledge. Kate seemed to know things about the Bell family and their neighbors, secrets, events, and details that no one outside the family could have known. It could describe what was happening in other parts of town as if it had been there itself, watching and listening. The voice also seemed to enjoy tormenting Betsy. It would call her name in the dead of night, whisper cruel things in her ear, and laugh whenever she cried out in fear. It wasn't just content with physical attacks anymore. It wanted to break her spirit, to make her feel hopeless and afraid. The once bright and happy child was now a shadow of herself, living in constant fear of when the voice would speak again, what it would say, and what it would do. John Bell was another favorite target of the witch. Kate often berated him, insulting him, and claiming that it had come to end his life. It was as though the entity had a personal vendetta against him. The reasons were never entirely clear, though rumors swirled that Kate Batts, a neighbor with whom John had a falling out over a land deal, had cursed the Bell family out of spite. Whether or not this was true didn't seem to matter. The entity that called itself Kate seemed determined to fulfill its promise. The Bell family's friends and neighbors were initially skeptical of their claims about a talking spirit. But that changed quickly when word spread of the strange occurrences, and people began visiting the Bell household themselves to hear the voice. Ministers, curious locals, and even travelers from neighboring counties came to witness the phenomenon, and none left without being thoroughly shaken by what they experienced. The witch, it seemed, enjoyed the attention. often showing off its knowledge of distant events or entertaining visitors by speaking in different voices and tones. It could imitate the voice of anyone it chose. Sometimes it would even mimic the voices of the family themselves, causing confusion and fear. As the entity continued to speak, it became clear that this was more than just a haunting. It was something far more dangerous. The witch took pleasure in manipulating those around it, bending their will through fear, and taunting them with its knowledge and power. The Bell family tried to get help from local ministers, hoping that religious intervention might drive the entity away, but nothing worked. The prayers, the exorcisms, the blessings on the house, none of it made any difference. The voice persisted, as powerful and menacing as ever. And with each passing day, the witch's focus on John Bell grew more intense. It would mock him relentlessly, whispering threats and insults while he went about his daily life. His health, already fragile from the stress of living under such torment, began to deteriorate further. He would wake up in the middle of the night to find himself unable to move, his limbs heavy as though held down by an invisible force. He started suffering from unexplained seizures, his once strong and commanding presence reduced to that of a sickly and terrified man. Despite the terror it inflicted, the Bell Witch's voice wasn't always violent. It had moments of disturbing calm where it would engage in conversations, sometimes even laughing and joking with visitors. It seemed to enjoy playing with people's emotions, luring them into a false sense of security before turning on them with renewed ferocity. The voice was always unpredictable. One moment, it would be soft and friendly, and the next it would erupt in anger, hurling insults or making sinister threats. The most chilling aspect of the witch's communication was its promise. It had come to take John Bell's life, and it wouldn't stop until it had succeeded. The family was trapped in their own home, with no means of escape from the torment that had invaded every corner of their lives. Each day brought them closer to the grim reality that the witch might indeed be able to carry out its threat. By now, the Bell Witch was not just a local legend, but a phenomenon that had captured the attention of people far and wide. Visitors continued to flock to the Bell Farm, seeking answers or hoping to experience the haunting for themselves. But for John Bell and his family, this was no spectacle. It was a living nightmare, and they were all too aware that the witch's promises were not idle threats. The Bell family had now come to understand the true nature of the entity they were dealing with. It wasn't just haunting them, it was targeting them, manipulating them, and working toward a single, terrifying goal. And as John Bell's health worsened, the family could only wait in dread, knowing that the worst was yet to come. As the witch's torment grew more relentless, it became clear that John Bell's days were numbered. The entity that had come to be known as the Bell Witch had made its intentions known from the start. It was determined to take John Bell's life, and now it seemed ready to fulfill that dark promise. Despite the Bell family's efforts to protect him, John's health was rapidly deteriorating, and there was little they could do to stop it. By late 1820, John had become a shadow of his former self. Once a strong and respected farmer, he was now a frail, weak man who could barely leave his bed. The constant stress and fear had taken a toll on him both physically and mentally, and the witch seemed to take delight in watching him waste away. His hands shook uncontrollably, and he struggled to speak or even move at times. The witch's attacks had become more personal, more direct, and more vicious as the weeks wore on. Each day brought new torments. The witch, with its unnerving voice, would whisper cruel taunts in John's ear, reminding him of its power over him. "Your time is near, John Bell," it would say, filling the room with a dark, ominous energy. Sometimes the voice would mock his weakness, laughing at his failing body, while other times it would grow angry. One evening, threatened, as the Bell family gathered in John's room, the witch's presence, the family could only watch in horror as John's condition worsened, thick and suffocating. John lay motionless, his breathing shallow and labored. He had been bedridden for days, and the once vibrant man was now barely recognizable. The room was tense with dread as the witch's voice filled the space again, speaking in low, menacing tones. It declared once more that it had come to end John's life, and there was nothing anyone could do to stop it. The following morning, on December 20th, 1820, John Bell did not wake. Lucy, his wife, was the first to find him lying still in his bed. His breathing had become so faint that, at first, it seemed like he might still be alive. But as she approached, it became clear that he was slipping away. She called for the children, and soon the entire family gathered by John's side, praying for a miracle that would never come. In the midst of their grief, the witch's voice rang out again, cold and triumphant. "I did it. I finished what I came to do." The words hung heavy in the air, and the family was left in stunned silence. The witch had claimed responsibility for John Bell's death, just as it had promised it would. There was no mistaking it now. The entity had carried out its grim mission. The cause of John's sudden decline and death had remained a mystery, but in the days following his passing, the family discovered something chilling. Among John's medicine bottles, they found one that contained a strange, unidentified liquid. No one in the family recognized it, and it hadn't been prescribed by the doctor. Desperate for answers, they tested the substance by giving a small amount to the family's cat. Tragically, the animal didn't survive for long after consuming the liquid, confirming the family's worst fears. This mysterious substance had likely been used to poison John Bell. When confronted with this discovery, the witch's voice erupted in gleeful laughter. "I gave him that potion," it proclaimed, reveling in its victory. There was no longer any doubt that the Bell Witch had been responsible for John's death, using the strange liquid to carry out its fatal plan. It was a devastating realization for the Bell family, who had fought so hard to protect John, only to lose him to the very force they had feared for so long. As the Bell family prepared for John's funeral, the witch continued its disturbing behavior. During the solemn event, while friends and neighbors gathered to pay their respects, the entity made its presence known in a horrifying display. The witch's voice interrupted the proceedings, mocking the mourners, laughing loudly, and making crude jokes at the expense of the grieving family. It was a final, cruel insult, adding a layer of humiliation to the pain and sorrow of John Bell's passing. The family was left devastated, unable to escape the reach of the entity, even in their time of mourning. The death of John Bell marked the culmination of the witch's campaign of terror. For years, the Bell family had endured unimaginable horrors, but now the entity had accomplished what it had set out to do from the very beginning. It had taken John's life, and it had done so with a sense of satisfaction and malicious pride. The family was left to pick up the pieces of their shattered lives, unsure of what would happen next. Yet, as dark as things had become, the witch's influence over the Bell household began to wane after John's death. The violent attacks on Betsy grew less frequent, and the oppressive atmosphere that had hung over the farm seemed to lift, if only slightly. The entity, it seemed, had fulfilled its purpose, and with John gone, its presence started to fade. Despite the diminishing torment, the Bell family could never truly move on from what had happened. The memory of John's suffering and the witch's cruel laughter haunted them, even as the physical manifestations of the haunting began to dissipate. For the Bell children, especially Betsy, the scars of those years would last a lifetime. John Bell's death left a mark not only on his family, but on the entire community. The story of the Bell Witch spread far beyond Adams, Tennessee, becoming a legend that would be passed down for generations. People from all over the country would hear the tale of the haunting, of the vengeful witch who had taken the life of a man without ever being seen. Though the entity seemed to have accomplished its goal, the question of why it had chosen John Bell and what truly fueled its hatred remained a mystery, one that would linger long after the haunting had ended. In the wake of John Bell's death, The Bell family hoped that the terror that had gripped their home for so many years might finally be over. The Bell Witch, after all, had achieved its dark purpose. It had taken John's life, just as it had promised, and for a while, it seemed that the entity might finally leave them in peace. The violent attacks on Betsy subsided, and the eerie disturbances that had plagued their home began to fade. But even though the immediate threat had diminished, the shadow of the Bell Witch still loomed over the family, the farm, and the entire community. In the months following John Bell's death, the once bustling Bell farmhouse became a place of deep sorrow and quiet reflection. The family tried to rebuild their lives, but the emotional scars left by the witch's torment were too deep to heal easily. Betsy, in particular, had suffered immensely. The physical attacks she had endured were gone, but the emotional trauma lingered. She had been haunted, manipulated, and terrorized by an unseen force that seemed to take joy in her pain. Now, though the witch's voice had gone silent, Betsy was left to grapple with the overwhelming fear and sadness that had become a part of her life. Despite the relative calm that followed John's death, the Bell family couldn't shake the feeling that the witch's presence still lingered, watching and waiting. They continued to hear faint, disembodied whispers from time to time, though the voice was not as aggressive as it once was. It was as if the entity was reminding them that it hadn't truly left, that it still had power over them. For the Bell family, life would never return to the way it had been before the haunting began. The peace they had once known was gone, replaced by the weight of the tragedy they had endured. As time passed, Betsy tried to move forward with her life. She had been engaged to a young man named Joshua Gardner before the haunting escalated, but the strain of the witch's attacks had put their relationship on hold. The entity had made it clear that it disapproved of their union, taunting Betsy about her engagement, and even going so far as to threaten Joshua's life. Betsy had been forced to break off the engagement, fearing that the witch's wrath would bring more suffering to those she loved. Even after John Bell's death, Betsy remained hesitant to reconnect with Joshua. She had no way of knowing whether the witch would return if she reignited the relationship. The fear of bringing the entity back into her life was too great, and so she made the difficult decision to move on. Betsy eventually married another man, Richard Powell, a local school teacher who had been a long-time family friend. Though Powell was much older than Betsy, their marriage brought her some measure of stability, and together they left Adams, Tennessee, to start a new life away from the farm that had become a place of nightmares. For the rest of the Bell family, life continued quietly on the farm. Though the Bell Witch's direct attacks had ceased, the farm remained a source of fascination and fear for the local community. Neighbors and visitors would often talk about the haunting in hushed tones, wondering if the witch might one day return. The legend of the Bell Witch grew, spreading far beyond the small Tennessee town. People from neighboring states came to visit the farm, hoping to catch a glimpse of the paranormal activity that had once terrorized the Bell family. As the years went by, the story of the Bell Witch took on a life of its own. The tale of the vengeful entity that had tormented the Bell family and claimed the life of John Bell became a piece of local folklore, passed down from generation to generation. It was whispered around campfires, told in taverns, and shared among friends. Each retelling seemed to grow more fantastical, adding new details and layers to the story. Some claimed the witch was the spirit of a wronged woman. Others believed it was a demon sent to punish John Bell for some unknown sin. The true origin of the Bell Witch remained a mystery, one that no amount of speculation could solve. Despite the enduring fear surrounding the legend, the Bell family's descendants were able to live relatively peaceful lives after the events. Betsy and her husband lived out the rest of their days away from Adams, and though they could never fully escape the memory of the haunting, they managed to build a life free from the witch's influence. The Bell farm remained in the family for generations, though none who lived there ever experienced the same level of terror that John and Betsy had. However, the Bell Witch wasn't entirely gone. Several years after John Bell's death, the entity reportedly returned to the farm for a brief period. It made its presence known by speaking to members of the Bell family, though its tone was far less menacing than it had been during its original reign of terror. It seemed almost playful this time, offering cryptic messages and making predictions about the future. The witch claimed it would return again one day, though it gave no clear indication of when or why. After a short time, the voice disappeared once more, leaving the family in a state of unease. True to its word, the Bell Witch never fully faded from memory. Even though the farm grew quiet again and no further violent hauntings occurred, the legacy of the witch remained firmly entrenched in the town's history. Locals continued to speak of the Bell Witch in reverent tones, warning their children not to venture too close to the old Bell property after dark, for fear that the spirit might still be lingering, waiting for another chance to wreak havoc. The legend of the Bell Witch has endured for nearly 2 centuries, captivating the imagination of those who hear it. Skeptics have tried to explain away the events as superstition or mass hysteria, while believers hold fast to the notion that something truly supernatural took place on the Bell farm. The story has inspired countless books, articles, and even films, solidifying its place as one of America's most famous hauntings. To this day, visitors still come to Adams, Tennessee, hoping to catch a glimpse of the Bell Witch or to feel the lingering energy of the entity that once terrorized a family and captivated a nation. Whether they are true believers or merely curious thrill seekers, they all leave with a sense of unease, as if the witch's spirit still lingers in the shadows, watching, waiting for the right moment to return. For the Bell family, the memory of those years will never fade. The death of John Bell, the torment of Betsy, and the voice that haunted their every waking moment left a mark that time could never fully erase. Though the witch's physical presence may have waned, its legacy lives on, a chilling reminder of the power of the unknown and the horrors that sometimes lie just beyond the veil of the ordinary. Anneliese Michel grew up in a small Bavarian village in post-war Germany, surrounded by the strong influence of the Catholic Church. From an early age, her life revolved around prayer, religious education, and a deep sense of devotion. Her parents, devout Catholics, believed that faith was the foundation of a moral life, and Anneliese embraced their teachings wholeheartedly. However, beneath the surface of this pious upbringing was a persistent pressure to achieve spiritual perfection, a burden she would carry throughout her short life. By the time she reached her teenage years, Anneliese felt an overwhelming sense of duty to live righteously. She avoided anything that might be considered sinful and constantly worried that her thoughts or actions might offend God. This need to be good was not just about faith. It became a source of intense anxiety. The line between religious devotion and fear of divine punishment grew thinner with each passing day. She confessed her sins frequently, sometimes obsessing over minor mistakes, such as missing a prayer or feeling envy toward a friend. To her, these slip-ups felt like betrayals, not just to God, but to herself. Her struggles with self-worth deepened when, at the age of 16, she experienced her first medical episode. During school, she suddenly lost control of her body, collapsing in a fit of convulsions. Confused and frightened, Anneliese woke up in the hospital, where doctors diagnosed her with temporal lobe epilepsy, a neurological disorder known to cause seizures, memory lapses, and hallucinations. Although the doctors assured her that medication would manage her symptoms, Anneliese sensed that her suffering had a deeper meaning. Why, she wondered, was she being afflicted this way? Had she somehow failed God? Despite taking prescribed anti-seizure medication, her symptoms persisted. Anneliese began to experience terrifying visual disturbances, shadowy figures that would appear in her bedroom, whispering cruel words she couldn't ignore. Sometimes, These hallucinations made her question if the people around her were really there. These experiences were deeply unsettling, leaving her exhausted and anxious. She isolated herself, withdrawing from social activities, fearful of judgment and embarrassment. Her parents, initially hopeful that treatment would improve her condition, grew increasingly concerned. Her inner turmoil also led to unsettling behaviors. At first, she simply punished herself for perceived failings, praying for hours without rest, or kneeling on hard surfaces until her knees were bruised. However, as her mental state deteriorated, these behaviors grew more extreme. She would wake up in the middle of the night and intentionally sleep on the cold floor, believing it was a form of penance. Other times, she deprived herself of basic comforts, like food and warmth, convinced that she needed to suffer to purify her soul. As the seizures and hallucinations continued, Annelise's sense of identity became increasingly fragmented. She began questioning if she was cursed or if an evil presence had taken root within her. The medical explanations offered little comfort. How could something as clinical as a brain disorder account for the overwhelming darkness that haunted her mind? To Annelise, her suffering felt like a spiritual battle, a test from God that she had to endure, no matter the cost. As Annelise entered adulthood, her mental and physical state deteriorated rapidly. The seizures became more frequent, and no combination of medications seemed to control them. But what disturbed her most were the terrifying visions and voices that invaded her mind. These were not just hallucinations. She believed they carried a message, one that filled her with fear. At first, it was the faint sound of whispers, but soon they grew louder and more hostile. The voices accused her of being unworthy, insisting she was beyond redemption. They told her she had failed, that her soul was lost. The once devout girl, who had cherished her faith, began to experience deep confusion. Praying, which had once given her comfort, now seemed impossible. The voices mocked her when she tried, telling her that God no longer listened. She avoided church, even tearing up prayer cards and damaging crucifixes in frustration. It was as if everything sacred that had once anchored her life now felt distant and unreachable. Her behavior became increasingly erratic. In moments of panic, she would lash out, not knowing how to cope with the overpowering emotions inside her. She withdrew from her family, spending long hours alone in her room, unable to find peace. Sometimes she would pace back and forth or sit for hours in silence, lost in the storm of thoughts that never seemed to quiet. What frightened her most was the sense that she no longer had control over herself. Her family tried their best to help, but the changes in Annelise were overwhelming. She refused to eat regular meals, not because of a lack of hunger, but because she believed that depriving herself was the only way to cleanse her spirit. The voices told her that she did not deserve comfort or nourishment. She began to experience strange impulses, behaviors she couldn't explain but felt compelled to follow. She might suddenly throw herself to the ground, feeling as though her body was not her own to command. Night after night, her sleep was interrupted by vivid nightmares of grotesque creatures and apocalyptic visions. Some nights she awoke in tears, convinced that her prayers had damned her instead of saved her. Other times she felt a compulsion to make herself physically uncomfortable, lying on the cold floor despite the warmth of her bed, or kneeling for hours until her legs trembled. These acts were not intended to harm, but felt like punishment she deserved. She hoped that, through suffering, she could find forgiveness for whatever unseen sin haunted her. The hallucinations worsened over time. Sometimes she saw figures she described as demons' twisted shapes with burning eyes lurking in the corners of her vision. She would scream and cry out to her parents, terrified by what she believed were real entities surrounding her. Her mother would try to comfort her, but nothing seemed to ease the fear. Even when the apparitions disappeared, their presence lingered in Annelise's mind. She believed these beings wanted to destroy her from within, and no amount of medical treatment could stop them. Doctors urged the family to remain patient, insisting that her symptoms were caused by her epilepsy and possibly a developing mental illness. Yet the Michel family was losing hope. Every new medication seemed to come with side effects that worsened Annelie's suffering, exhaustion, mood swings, and feelings of despair. They began to suspect that what tormented their daughter went beyond science's understanding. Meanwhile, Anneliese herself grew more convinced that her affliction was not a medical problem, but a spiritual one. She told her parents that the medications were useless because she was not sick in the way the doctors thought. Something evil, she believed, had taken root inside her, and only faith could drive it out. She spoke of hearing names in her mind, figures she identified as Judas, Nero, and others condemned in Christian tradition. These presences taunted her, making her believe she was trapped in a battle for her soul. By the time Anneliese's condition reached its breaking point, the Michel family had exhausted every medical option available to them. Each visit to a neurologist or psychiatrist ended with a prescription for new medications, anticonvulsants, antipsychotics, but nothing relieved Anneliese's torment. As weeks turned into months, her parents began to believe that something far beyond medicine was plaguing their daughter. They were devout Catholics, and it became increasingly difficult for them to ignore the possibility that Anneliese's suffering was spiritual, not merely medical. Anneliese, too, had abandoned hope in medical explanations. She insisted that what controlled her wasn't a disease, but a dark force. Her strange behavior and outbursts now carried a sinister weight. She claimed that malevolent beings inhabited her, whispering blasphemies and urging her to reject everything good in her life. The voices were relentless, taunting her and telling her she was destined for ruin. At times, she felt she couldn't even pray because the words became twisted in her mouth, as if the darkness within her was interfering. Her family sought the advice of local priests, hoping that the church could offer the help that doctors could not. However, the priests were cautious. Official exorcisms were rare and required proof that the afflicted person's condition could not be explained by illness alone. The priests advised the Michels to continue with medical treatment, but Anneliese's worsening state left them feeling helpless. Each passing day revealed new signs of her struggle. She would refuse meals for extended periods, explaining that it was part of a personal penance, or spend hours staring at religious objects, visibly distressed as if in conflict with herself. Despite these alarming signs, most of the clergy remained hesitant. However, Father Ernst Alt, a local priest, became deeply concerned about Anneliese's condition. He believed her suffering was unlike anything he had encountered before. After meeting with Anneliese, he noted the strange shifts in her personality, moments where she seemed possessed by an overwhelming rage, only to collapse moments later, apologizing and sobbing uncontrollably. Father Alt, but these episodes were more than medical symptoms. He suspected that something spiritual was taking hold of her. The priest's belief was further cemented by Anneliese's growing resistance to sacred items. On several occasions, she recoiled from crucifixes as if in pain and was unable to enter chapels, insisting that an unseen force was blocking her. Father Alt urged the family to pursue an exorcism, believing that it was the only way to save her. He explained that exorcisms were not quick fixes. They were difficult rituals that required time, endurance, and faith from everyone involved. But if her condition truly stemmed from a spiritual affliction, the ritual was their only option. To perform the rite, however, they needed formal permission from the diocese. Father Alt, along with another priest, Father Arnold Renz, documented Anneliese's worsening symptoms and sent a request to Bishop Joseph Stangl. After reviewing the case, the bishop granted approval for the ritual Romanum, the official rite of exorcism. The priests were instructed to follow strict guidelines, ensuring the ritual was performed with care and precision. Annalise welcomed the news of the exorcism. By this point, she was utterly convinced that she was being consumed by something evil, and she saw the ritual as her only hope for salvation. She told her parents that the demons inside her claimed they would never let her go, but she believed that through suffering, she could defeat them. Annalise began to view her suffering not just as punishment, but as a form of sacrifice. She believed that her trials could help cleanse others, perhaps even atone for the sins of strangers she had never met. Her family was equally desperate for a solution, no matter how difficult it might be. They believed that the exorcism would be a path to healing, though none of them could have predicted the toll it would take. Annelise's condition had already pushed them to the edge emotionally, spiritually, and physically. Yet, the promise of deliverance gave them a glimmer of hope that perhaps, at long last, their daughter could be freed from the torment that had consumed her life. But with that hope came fear. They knew the ritual would be grueling, and they worried about what it would do to Annelise's fragile body. The priest warned them that the exorcism might provoke violent episodes and that there were no guarantees of success. But for the Michels, this was their final option. Medical treatments had failed, and time was slipping away. All they could do now was trust in the power of their faith and in Annelise's belief that salvation was worth any price. In the fall of 1975, the first exorcism session began inside the Michel family's modest home. The room, dimly lit by candles and filled with religious artifacts, carried the quiet heaviness of fear and hope. Father Arnold Renz and Father Ernst Alt led the ceremony, reciting prayers from the Ritual Romanum, the ancient text used to expel evil spirits. The atmosphere was tense, every word of the prayer heavy with expectation. Annalise sat in the middle of the room, her hands trembling in her lap, waiting for the first confrontation with whatever force held her captive. From the very beginning, the sessions were harrowing. As the priest prayed over her, Annelise's demeanor shifted rapidly. At times, she appeared peaceful, mouthing along with familiar prayers. But soon after, her voice would change, becoming low, hoarse, and full of malice. She would thrash violently in her chair, growling and shouting words she claimed weren't her own. It was as though multiple personalities had taken control, each one angry and defiant. She identified these voices as belonging to notorious figures like Judas and even darker beings, insisting that they lived within her and refused to leave. The exorcisms were physically and emotionally draining, not only for Annalise, but for everyone involved. The priests and her parents often had to restrain her when she would throw herself onto the floor or bang her head against walls, driven by impulses she couldn't explain. Despite their efforts, Annelise's physical condition began to deteriorate. Her body, already fragile from the months of self-denial, grew weaker with each passing session. She was unable to keep down food, convinced by the voices that she must reject earthly nourishment to complete her mission. The priest tried to encourage her to eat, but Annalise refused, believing that her suffering was necessary for salvation. Each exorcism session lasted for hours, sometimes stretching late into the night. Her parents were horrified by what they witnessed. Annelise's voice shifting into guttural tones that didn't sound human, her body convulsing uncontrollably, and her skin breaking out in unexplained marks and bruises. Yet there were brief moments of lucidity, when she would beg her family to continue the ritual, insisting that she could feel the darkness being forced to the surface. Her parents clung to these moments, believing that Annelise's suffering was bringing her closer to freedom. They prayed alongside the priests, sometimes holding her hands as she trembled, and whispered that she could feel herself slipping away. To them, each session, no matter how excruciating, was a step closer to reclaiming their daughter from the grip of evil. Over the course of 10 months, more than 60 exorcism sessions were performed. Annelise's condition worsened with each one. She rarely slept, her nights filled with haunting visions that left her gasping for breath. During the day, she would pace the house or sit silently, lost in her thoughts, her once bright personality reduced to a shadow of its former self. As the rituals dragged on, the demon seemed to resist with greater intensity. Annalise would scream for hours, her voice cracking from exhaustion. She would mock the priests, taunting them with obscene language, daring them to continue. The priests remained resolute, believing that the intensity of her resistance was a sign that the exorcism was working. They prayed louder, reciting the sacred words over and over, hoping to wear down whatever force held her captive. The toll on Annelise's body was undeniable. She became severely underweight, her limbs weak and trembling from exhaustion. Her knees were swollen and bruised from hours spent kneeling in prayer, her voice hoarse from constant screaming. Yet she refused to stop. She believed that her suffering was part of a larger plan, that by enduring these trials, she was helping to save others from spiritual harm. To Annalise, this was no longer just about her freedom. It was a sacrifice for a higher purpose. Despite her family's pleas for rest, Annalise insisted on continuing the exorcisms. She begged her parents not to abandon the ritual, even though they could see her body was slowly giving out. Her mother often cried during the sessions, watching helplessly as her daughter endured what seemed like unbearable pain. But Annalise would always reassure her, saying that it would all be over soon, that she would be free, even if it meant surrendering everything she had left. The priests, too, struggled with the emotional weight of the situation. Father Renz and Father Out spent countless hours in prayer, asking for strength to continue. They knew that Annelise's condition was worsening, but they believed that abandoning the ritual would be tantamount to giving in to the forces they were fighting. The line between faith and desperation blurred, and the priests pressed forward, hoping that each session would finally bring the deliverance they sought. Toward the end of the exorcisms, Annelise's moments of clarity became fewer and far between. Her speech slowed, her movements were weak and uncoordinated, and her eyes, once bright with determination, grew distant. Yet she never expressed regret for what she had endured. In her rare, lucid moments, she whispered to her parents and the priests that she was ready for the end, whatever that might mean. By June 1976, Annalise Michel's body was ravaged from months of relentless exorcisms and physical exhaustion. Her frame was skeletal, her movements slow and unsteady. Yet, despite her weakened state, she clung to a fierce belief that the torment she endured had a higher purpose. Every breath she took felt like a battle, but Annalise was certain that she was on the verge of liberation, that through suffering, she could achieve a form of spiritual victory. Her parents were filled with both hope and dread. They wanted to believe that the end was near, that their daughter would finally be free from the torment that had consumed her for years. But they also saw the toll it had taken. Annalise could no longer walk without assistance, and speaking was a struggle. Still, whenever she had moments of lucidity, she insisted that the exorcisms continue. "I have to keep going," she whispered to her mother one night, her voice barely audible. "I'm almost there." The exorcism sessions became increasingly urgent as the priests and her family sensed that they were running out of time. During one of the final rituals, Annelise's body convulsed violently, her face twisted in pain. Yet, between these intense moments, she would sometimes flash a strange, serene smile, telling those around her that she could feel the darkness weakening. It was as if she believed that each moment of agony brought her closer to a divine release. On June 30th, 1976, the final exorcism session took place. Annalise was too weak to kneel, so she lay on a mattress placed on the floor. Her parents, desperate and exhausted, held her hands, hoping against hope that this would be the moment of deliverance. Father Renz and Father Out recited the exorcism prayers with steady determination, their voices filling the room with sacred verses. Annelise's breathing was shallow, but she forced herself to respond to the prayers, whispering yes and please stay with me whenever she had the strength. Throughout the session, Annelise's expressions alternated between anguish and moments of strange peace. At one point, she looked into her mother's eyes and murmured, "Mother, I'm afraid." Her mother stroked her hair, fighting back tears, assuring Annalise that she was not alone. They all prayed that this would be the final battle, that the forces tormenting her would release their grip at last. Toward the end of the ritual, Annalise's voice softened, and she said something that haunted those present for years to come. "Please, don't give up on me." But as the hours dragged on, her strength gave out. The session ended without the sense of triumph they had hoped for, and Annalise, too weak to speak, closed her eyes and drifted into a restless sleep. The following morning, on July 1st, 1976, Annalise Michel passed away quietly in her home. Her parents discovered her lifeless body and, in their grief, called the priests to inform them of her passing. Annelise's frail frame, reduced to just over 60 pounds, was a tragic testament to the suffering she had endured. For her family and the priests, the overwhelming question was whether her death was a spiritual victory or an unbearable loss. The tragedy did not end with Annelise's passing. In the months that followed, the case drew public attention, leading to an investigation that scrutinized the actions of her parents and the priests. Authorities questioned whether Annelise's death could have been prevented had medical intervention been prioritized over religious rituals. Her parents and the priests were charged with negligent homicide, sparking a controversial trial that captivated the nation and raised difficult questions about the intersection of faith and mental health. During the trial, Annelise's parents defended their decision, insisting that they had followed their daughter's wishes and had acted out of love and desperation. They described Annalise as a willing participant in the exorcisms, someone who truly believed that her suffering had meaning. The priests, too, stood by their actions, explaining that they had exhausted every other option and that Annalise herself had pleaded for the rituals to continue. Medical experts testified that Annalise's condition was likely the result of untreated epilepsy and psychosis, worsened by the extreme stress of the exorcisms. But for those closest to Annalise, the answer was more complicated. They believed that Annalise's suffering could not be fully explained by medical terms, that something deeper had taken place, something beyond human understanding. In the end, the priests and Annalise's parents were found guilty of negligent homicide, but received suspended sentences, as the court acknowledged that they had acted out of a misguided sense of care and faith. The verdict left many unresolved questions. Was Annalise a victim of untreated illness, or did she truly endure a spiritual trial? And if her suffering was real, did it accomplish the redemption she had hoped for? Annalise's story remains both a cautionary tale and a source of reflection on the complexities of faith, mental health, and the human need for meaning. To this day, some view her as a tragic figure who was failed by the systems meant to help her, while others believe that she experienced a spiritual battle that few can understand. In the years following her death, her grave became a place of pilgrimage for those who believed in the possibility of miracles. Visitors left flowers, prayers, and messages, hoping that, in some way, Annelise's suffering had opened a path to healing. But for her family and the priests who had stood by her, the story was one of profound loss, a reminder that sometimes the search for salvation can lead to unimaginable sacrifice.